When did the problems of Philippine politics first start? I think this is a very important question and also one that one cannot really answer, but I'm going to give some suggestions, some ways that this has been answered by many historians and political scientists over the past several years. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to go in reverse chronological order, starting from somewhat more recently back all the way to hundreds of years ago. I'm going to go to maybe 5 or 6 different options, and again, you could have many different things. I'm just arbitrarily choosing 5 or 6. It could be 10, it could be 12, it could be 15, it could be whatever number it is. It could only just be 2 or 3, but for the sake of this video, I wanted to focus on 5 or 6, and I want to preface that this is not necessarily what I believe. This is what has been said, and what I just want to explore these ideas out loud, and so that other people can also be aware of them, because I think this is a question at the heart of our politics today, as it should always be. Where did the problems of our society begin or start, or when was it aggravated? Okay, so the first possible option we're gonna offer is the Cory Aquino administration. This is from 1987 to 1992, and the reason why some may think Cory Aquino's administration is a big part of the problems of society today, that we can kind of assign some blame to them, is because they were in charge of the restructuring of Philippine society, the formation of a new constitution. Of the idea was that they were meant to symbolize the hope that Philippine society could, emerge out of the Marcos dictatorship as a new kind of, as a phoenix out of the ashes, and we have this ability to properly create a good government for ourselves. And a lot of the systematic problems in Philippine society, theoretically could have been manipulated somewhat, or changed somewhat by doing something differently with the constitution. Many problems that we have today, for example, the idea that Rodrigo Duterte could run for vice president, well, that's allowed because that is a hole in the 1987 constitution, and many other things like the allocation of pork barrel funds, all this stuff. There are many things that have allowed people to be very corrupt in Philippine society over the past 20-30 years that was allowed by the Aquino administration, and therefore it set precedent as well for the future ones. And this is something you can argue. It was a big opportunity lost. One of the interesting things, for example, is that a big part of a significant part of the fall of the Marcos dictatorship was the role of the left, for example. And when the Aquino administration came into power, they were even actually more repressive towards leftist activists than the Marcos administration arguably was. So, it was a very complicated time, the Cory Aquino administration, and I think so much of it is kind of lost in our history, in our minds, because of the recent, presidency of Noy Noy, where a lot of the kind of iconography of the Aquino administration, of people power, was brought back up. But, in terms of the political science historical lens, there are a lot of issues that many people have pointed towards, such as how, the formation of the new elite was, instead of kind of creating a more democratic Philippine society, it actually reverted us back to pre-Marcos era Philippine society, where the same elite families ended up controlling the same they regained the power that they lost to the Marcos cronies in the 70s and 80s. Instead of having it become a more democratic society, we just went back in time to pre-Marcos era Philippines. Okay, so one answer, Cory Aquino's administration. What else could we look back to? An obvious one, of course, is Marcos administration. Now, Marcos administration was obviously a very fraught time for freedom of speech, and the freedom of journalists to conduct their investigations into the way that the government is being run. It was very repressive for many people in the left and journalists. And one of the worst parts of the Marcos administration is that honestly, it's difficult to know where to start with Marcos, but one of the ways it still impacts us today, for example, is the establishment of his cronies, for example. The Marcos cronies who ended up rising in power and influence are still present today in Philippine society. Many of the big businessmen in the Philippines who are very successful, I don't want to name names, but many of them were Marcos cronies, and even though the political establishment kind of shifted, the people who had power kind of mostly remained in power. And then they added the power from the Aquino cronies of sorts, or the Aquino families, who were the elites. And you just have this kind of system in place right now in Philippine society, where many of the people who are extremely rich are still there in that position because society has been nice to them. Marcos, he got exiled, he died, but many of the people who were a part of the Marcos government, many of the people who were a part of the Marcos corruption kind of machine, still remained in government and still influence our lives today. Many of them are still in politics today, and there were not many really any repercussions to their kind of lives, I guess. Many of them continued on to Aquino's administration, and so Marcos has a hand in doing all of that stuff. And there are many other problems of society that we can attribute to the Marcos administration, such as problems with the economy, which you can kind of read about further. But Marcos administration has a lot of issues, obviously, and it has created this weird sense of, for the people who feel affected by it most, there's like a PTSD of sorts towards dictatorships and totalitarianism and all this stuff that still influence the lives of everyone today. And so a lot of our political polarization, for example, could be with the rise of Bongbong Marcos and all this stuff. All of that was built and formed, and the fractures of our history, of our politics, a lot of it happened because of the Marcos administration, and all of those things are really big problems as well still today. Okay, so I'm trying to decide where to go next. Cory Aquino, Marcos. Let's say okay, another person who we can argue is like a big cause of this is Manuel Quezon. Not many people who I know that much about Manuel Quezon, because I think we're not really taught that much about Quezon, and a lot of Quezon in popular culture, it's very hagiographic, or it's very looking at him as if he was some kind of saint. But Manuel Quezon, he was the Senate president from 1917 or so, and he became president in 1935. And Manuel Quezon actually recently has had, or over the past few years, if you look for it, there's a lot of studies about what kind of president he was, and you'd realize that Manuel Quezon actually is a big part of the formation of the political system that we have in the country today. The form of political bribery is very common. Patron-client relations, clientelism, American clientelism, all this stuff is related and goes back to the administration of Manuel Quezon. He was a very astute politician. He was like the epitome of the politician who would get whatever he wanted and know how to kind of Machiavellianly. He knows how to manipulate different provinces and different governments and different people in order to get what he wants and to consolidate power. Manuel Quezon he was like trying to consolidate power in a way that there will be just one single party. So he would be the sole dictator. At a time in the 30s, fascism was very common around the world, and so there were many people who were slowly consolidating dictatorships, and Quezon seems to have been someone who also wanted to have that. So he really, a lot of the political systems in place that allowed him to kind of gain power by bribing local politicians to get them to, make sure their constituencies vote for him, and sabotaging his political opponents by threats and scandals. All this stuff was really developed and arguably perfected by Manuel Quezon. And you can even say a lot of the issues in how the political system is structured, how the relationship between national politics and local politics, all of that, and American politics, all that connection, all that stuff was developed and perfected and started and by Manuel Quezon. He had his own cronies as well. He received bribes and he would get paid by businesses, and then he would use that money for his campaign. They'll give donations. This is something that I was surprised to read about, but it seems like a lot of the things, for example, that we even look at, say, Marcos administration, where we talk about the Marcos cronies, we talk about political repression under Marcos and even Aquino. All that stuff was also present under Manuel Quezon. And he was the first president of the Commonwealth. So you can say, we don't talk about it at all because, and Manuel Quezon's grandson is still a columnist. I think Manuel Quezon III, he writes a lot. He's a journalist. Not so much as talked about in the public sphere, in the cultural sphere, about the many, things we could attribute to Manuel Quezon that have really destroyed Philippine society. Okay, so Manuel Quezon, Marcos, Cory, again, you can kind of choose different presidents as well. You can give different arguments. I'm just giving some examples. Maybe when did Philippine politics first have issues, or when did the problems start? You could say possibly American colonization. So in general, the fact that we were colonized by America, they had a big hand in the shaping of our political systems, as well as our educational systems, as well as many of our, I think, if we were to really look at it carefully, most of our we have more of our society today was shaped during the American period, which lasted for about 50 years, compared to the entire 300 years of Spanish occupation. The American period really focused on just radically changing Philippine society, kind of forming the government system. Their occupation of Mindanao with the Moro province was a big. It changed it changed how the Philippines was divided. A lot of our education, how we think of Philippine history, is because of the people who the American kind of government officials chose to put in charge. So, for example, when America first came here, there were actually many Filipinos who were a big part of the political system that were handpicked by the United States, as well as like Quezon and Osmeña, but they had a big hand in it as well. But the United States chose the upcoming leaders that would rule the government, and most of them came from the same political class. They were people who, the same political, economic, social class. They were handpicked by the Americans to rule the government. So you could argue that some of the inequalities or some of the ways in which things were constructed or written in history, so much of it, was because of the American colonization. And even you can extend it to say, even after Americans left the Philippines, we still were very profoundly tied to them economically. It ruined our ability to produce for ourselves because of our dependence on their economy. We were more consumers. We had to buy products from them. We were not really incentivized to produce products to sell to them. We had to buy their products. And all this stuff, which really put us in a bad shape after the Americans fully left, and we were left to fend on our own. And they had this project of American, putting American democracy or whatever. But then you can argue. Some people have argued that it was like an aborted process because of the war, it wasn't able to really fully reach its potential, and because of all this stuff, we were left with like a half-formed system of things that ended up becoming used by the people who wanted power locally and abused to lead us to the situation we have today. Definitely a lot of things we can blame in our current society can be traced back to the American period. Unfortunately, it is a period that is not as much, I think, well studied or well talked about in Philippine society, because people still have somewhat of a fondness to American culture and American society. So it's hard for us to really look at how it influenced deeply our politics and our police force, even our military. All this stuff is from American colonization. I'm gonna do two more. Before American colonization, of course, is Spanish colonization. We can say some of the problems in Philippine history began with Spanish colonization, particularly because we were quite separated. They made a very strong race and class divide that allowed a few people to accumulate more and more wealth, and allowed those families, the family dynasties, to really proliferate over time. Many of if you look at Philippine society today, many really rich people are still people who had families that were rich back in Spanish era Philippines. For example, Rojas, Araneta, Zobel de Ayala, all these people, all these families, which are also kind of all related as well. I think they intermarried with each other. All of them were the same people who were the richest people in the 1700s, 1800s in Philippine society under Spanish colonization. So, this is a lot of quite interesting stuff. And if you look at family dynasties, and if you look at the separation between the cities and the very strong economic political divide between people who live in the city versus people who live outside of it, all this stuff can be traced back to Spanish colonization. And of course, a lot of our culture was developed then. So if you have any problems with certain parts of Philippine culture or Philippine attitudes, you can look back and find probably some form of it beginning with Spanish colonization. And finally, pre-colonial society. That's an easy answer for where it started. And where can we, we don't really have many texts about pre-colonial Philippine society that still are, can be read today. But if you read the journals, the diaries of Antonio Pigafetta on the trip of Ferdinand Magellan, you'll find something very interesting, which is that when they were visiting the Philippines for the first time they entered here, they realized that every island had its own king, and each king was brothers or relatives with the king of another island. One was the brother of this one, cousin of this one was married to the sister of this one. And so you realize that every island at the time, it seemed like, had political dynasties, family dynasties that they passed on and they intermarried, and so this economic divide was there even during pre-colonial times. So Maybe the problems of Philippine society started there, but yeah, it's interesting stuff, and maybe I'll go into some of this more depth in the future.